Hello everybody, the election is coming up and I thought I would quickly make a video about my thoughts on lesser evilism. For those of us on the left, we're not really ever happy with either of the two major presidential candidates, and for that reason there is this recurring debate about whether we should just plug our nose and vote for the lesser of the two evils, which is, the Democratic Party, or whether we should withhold our vote and vote for some third party in protest. People who support voting for the lesser of two evils, which in this case is Kamala Harris, point out that there isn't really any chance of a third party to win, and that anyone who votes for a third party is taking away support from the Democrats, which makes them more likely to lose to the Republicans, who are the greater evil. The basic idea is that, look, no matter how bad the Democrats are, if they are less bad than the Republicans, you should prefer them to be in power because, well, less evil is less bad than more evil. And, I think to be fair, I actually agree with that basic utilitarian logic. I think that you should vote in the way that has the best consequences. And so, at a first glance, this argument seems pretty plausible. On the other hand, people who advocate for voting for a third party often do so by making more emotional appeals and appeals to abstract principles. They'll say that, there are just certain red lines that a party can't cross, and no matter what, after they've crossed those red lines, you shouldn't vote for them. But that's not all there is to it. If you're on the left, you're not really happy with the status quo, and so you're going to need to try to make some kind of change to the political system. And the only kind of leverage that you have over any of these political parties in the system is by being able to withhold your vote. If you promise to give your vote away beforehand unconditionally, then you have sacrificed your political power, since the party no longer has any interest in satisfying your demands and will only slide further to the right in pursuit of those in the middle. I've heard some people who are in the vote for the lesser of the two evils camp say things like, well, no, what you can do is you can vote for the lesser of the two evils, but once they get in office, you can try to push them further left. But I'm really not sure how you can do that without at some point withholding your vote. I think that these people tend to have like a political vision of sort of gradually moving the Overton window slightly to the left in order for it to be more politically practical for the major parties to act in line with left-wing interests. But still, even in this case, the Democratic Party will not have an interest in satisfying your political objectives on the left unless you threaten to withhold your vote. So at some point, you're going to have to be able to withhold your vote, and at first glance, this argument also sounds reasonable. So, which argument is right? Well, I think that they're both right, in a way. And when it comes to whether we should vote for the lesser of two evils or vote for a third party in protest, I think it depends on a variety of contingent factors. I think it depends on what you stand to lose, what you stand to gain, and how your protest will be perceived in the national discourse. I'm going to play hide the ball a little bit with my overall determination in the context of this election because I think that it's the least interesting thing that I have to add. What I do want to do is to make a few basic points that would help facilitate more useful discussion about the question, as well as identify some attitudes which I find unhelpful. The first major point that I'd like to make is that politics does not start and end with who you vote for in the presidential election. I know people who will argue until they're blue in the face about why you should vote for their preferred candidate, but then who know nothing about what's going on at the local level. If you vote for one of the two major candidates, in all likelihood, your vote will not make any difference, especially if you live in a safe state. Then you know that your vote has no impact whatsoever on the state of affairs in this country. But, when it comes to local stuff, you can actually move the needle a little bit. And especially if you're active and vocal and you do things like canvass for local candidates, you can make a difference. There are also better uses of your time that have nothing to do with electoral politics. You could volunteer for a worthy cause in your community or participate in mutual aid or something like that. And make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Don't use politics as a distraction from going to therapy. If you're able, make sure you're getting exercise. Find a good progressive church community, learn to meditate, whatever. voting is good, but there are other important things too. So one attitude that I find extremely unhelpful is when you're really gung-ho about the Democratic Party and spend all this time berating disaffected lefty voters for protest voting, but then do literally nothing else to be politically active. If you really believe in the two-party system, I'd respect it a lot more if you went out to canvass for Kamala Harris or did like phone banking or something. But spending hours arguing with your family or people on like Twitter and Facebook is just a waste of time. Now, I know that sounds just like nihilistic doomerism to a lot of you, so don't worry, I'll be talking about national politics. And as far as that is concerned, there are important things that you can do. I think the most important thing for people on the left to do is to help with building an alternative. As for what exactly that alternative should look like, that's up for debate. It's something that the left has argued about for a very long time, but whatever form that you think it should take, there needs to be an alternative to the two major parties that we have today. Now, there are certainly a number of ways in which the Democratic Party is better than the Republican Party. As far as I understand, the National Labor Relations Board was much more worker-friendly under Biden than it was under Trump. Biden got us out of Afghanistan. He reduced drone strikes dramatically, and he has some kind of industrial policy. And also, Trump's Supreme Court justice picks allowed for Roe v. Wade to get overturned. And this whole entire election denial shtick is inimical to a properly functioning democracy. That being said, the Democratic Party has consistently slid to the right, particularly with immigration, where they put forward basically a right-wing immigration bill. And in foreign policy as well, like with their support for the genocides in Yemen and Palestine. And some of you may be thinking, wait a second, isn't the Biden administration working around the clock to get a ceasefire deal done? They express all this concern about how Israel is handling the war. And just recently, they threatened to stop sending weapons to Israel if they kept blocking aid from coming into Gaza. Unfortunately, this is all just public relations management. The Biden administration is lying, and it should disgust you. If they really wanted a ceasefire, they could have made a quick call like Reagan did and ended this a long time ago. It's simple. All they had to do was to stop sending weapons. So when the Biden administration says all these things about, we believe Palestinians have a right for self-determination and we're trying to get a ceasefire, they're lying. It's just as brazen of a lie as when Donald Trump was lying about how big the crowd was at his inauguration. And if you don't believe me, then take it from Matthew Miller, who is the spokesperson for the United States Department of State, who let it slip that the Biden administration has never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. Also, it should be considered a very bad sign that architect of the Iraq War, Dick Cheney, endorsed Kamala Harris. If you get an endorsement like that and then you celebrate it, you're probably not very far left. Just saying. And as far as domestic economics is concerned, which I would probably consider to be one of the Biden administration's strong points, it certainly is a far cry from the era of the New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And this should come as no surprise because the not-so-Democratic Party is owned and operated by the 1%. There are some differences as to which particular interests are more or less dominant in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but that basic political economic fact is true in both cases. While we certainly do have some level of influence, and to be fair, the Democrats receive more support from organized labor, but when push comes to shove, it is the interests of the rich and the capitalist elite that steer that party. I feel like the conversations that I see online about left-wing strategy put forward this sort of false dichotomy between being pro-revolution, which means that your strategy is to dress up in balaclava and burn down the local dog park, and being pro-reform, which means that you think you're going to bring about socialism by voting for Joe Biden. And the conversation is actually far more complicated than that, but what I will say is that there have been successful reform movements in the past that have won significant gains for normal working people like me and you, and they did so by forming social democratic parties which were governed by the interests of the normal working people and not the ruling elite. It sometimes also included involving making broad coalitions, like in the Frente Amplio in Uruguay, which was a coalition consisting of Marxists and Christian Democrats and others. Plausible alternatives also include organizations which are not political parties at all, like the Democratic Socialists of America. These kinds of groups can play a role in educating the electorate and gaining political leverage by lending or withdrawing their support to different parties. Other factions within the left have had other ideas about how to change society as well, like anarchists, for example. They tend to emphasize the role of mutual aid and direct action, and I think that these kinds of strategies can do a lot of good for communities. So, I'm not going to say which alternative is necessarily the best, or whether any existing political party like the Green Party is that alternative. That's a discussion for people much smarter than me to have and to come to an overall determination on. But I do think that we need to start working on some kind of alternative so that we can take political power from the rich and give it to normal working people. I also do want to tack on a little bit of a cheeky side point here. The sort of straw man of the protest voters' position is that they're not really politically serious, but rather selfishly retaining their sense of moral purity at the expense of real-world consequences. So the lesser evilists will object to it on utilitarian grounds. But if you're a utilitarian, then everybody's well-being matters, including the person casting the vote. And if voting in protest makes you feel better, and it might not just be to a trivial degree, by the way, voting for someone that you can't stand might really deeply bother you and make it hard for you to focus and give your all in other areas. Then for a utilitarian, that weighs on the scales. And given how little of a difference your vote usually makes, frankly, I think it's not the best reason, but that can be a perfectly fine reason to do a protest vote. The second main point that I'd like to make is that the value of your vote isn't determined strictly by whether the candidate you voted for won or not. A lot of people will say that a protest vote is a wasted vote because the candidate you're voting for has no chance of winning. But that's just not true. Electoral campaigns can serve as a way of educating the electorate and providing a vision for how an alternative could look like. I think a really good example of this would be Bernie Sanders' presidential runs in 2020 and 2016. He didn't win, but does that mean that his presidential runs were a complete waste of time and that everybody who canvassed for him should have just gone home and smoked a doobie? Of course not. Even though Bernie Sanders didn't win, he was able to get a lot of people, including people like myself, interested and engaged in politics. He went a long way to destigmatizing the word socialism and showing how progressive ideas are actually really popular. I also think that seeing the ways in which the party establishment stacked the deck against him was really revelatory for a lot of us and helped us understand the systemic issues within the Democratic Party. There are also other worthwhile short-term political objectives besides winning it all. If a third party like the Green Party, for example, were able to get 5% of the national vote, then they'd be officially categorized as a minor party and start receiving federal funding, which would really help expand their operations and in turn put a voice out there in the national discussion for actual left-wing politics. If such a third party grew, or a coalition of parties were able to grow, they could use their strength as a bargaining chip on a few key issues and trade their support for the Democrats in exchange for concessions on a few of those key issues. Now, my next point is going to be a little bit controversial, so I'm going to try to weigh into it with a little bit of nuance. There is a possibility that withholding your vote from the Democratic Party could send a message by punishing them. When they see that they actually have to earn your vote, they might move further left to do so. So even if a mass exodus to a left-wing third party caused the Democrats to lose, this could have long-term beneficial effects because it could force the Democratic Party to change course in the future. There are certainly plausible mechanisms that would produce this outcome because, they do want to get more votes, and in my opinion, Kamala Harris picking Tim Walz is an example of this effect. I think that Kamala Harris was aware that the Biden administration had alienated a lot of their progressive base with their support for the genocide in Palestine. And Tim Walz was, in my view, one of the more, if not most progressive options for vice president. I think in an alternate universe where the genocide in Palestine was not occurring and where the base was not so disgruntled, that she might have picked a more conservative vice presidential candidate in order to get voters in the center. But, that's just my gut reaction, and feel free to disagree. Now, the reason that I say that this point is controversial is because it is also possible that a protest vote works the other way. It is possible that the Democratic Party would instead think that the left-wing vote is impossible to get, and they might just shift further to the right to get people in the center. So if a mass exodus to a left-wing third party caused the Democrats to lose, this could cause people to blame the left and become more inimical to their ideas, thereby producing the opposite of the desired reaction, because now the left would be perceived as a political enemy. So which reaction is more likely? Well, I think it depends, and I think it's beyond the pay grade of some random guy on YouTube such as myself to determine what will be the case at any given conjuncture, but I do think that there are some things that are fair to say from an armchair. Firstly, I think that no matter what happens, the party establishment and the corporate media and the people in the center are going to blame the left. It is in their interests to do so, and I remember hearing a lot of people trying to blame Bernie Sanders for Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016, which, of course, I think was very ridiculous, given that he did a pretty good job of uniting with her against Trump after the primary. So no matter what happens, there's going to be a battle over how to interpret the role of the left in the election, win or lose. And so if you're on the left, your job is to make sure that whatever happens, people do not walk away with the interpretation that the left is the enemy. If it is the case that Kamala Harris loses the election because her base was so alienated over her support for the genocide in Palestine, then you need to be out there making the case that it is the Biden administration's fault for having such horrible policies and not the left's fault for not being able to stomach support for a genocide. So whether or not a protest vote has the desired effect is not something that we can know a priori, but rather is a contingency that depends on a variety of factors. Many of these factors are already stacked against us, like what do the moneyed interests want and so forth. But one thing that I think does make a difference is the nature of the protest and which issues are foregrounded. I think certainly in the case of 2016 and 2020, when you had people who were Bernie or bust, they could certainly give the appearance of being intransigent and unwilling to compromise, since they were protesting against what was presented as moderate incrementalism, which contrasted with ambitious reform. So that definitely is easier to construe as someone just being unwilling to play ball because they didn't get everything they wanted. And that definitely is something that is really offensive to liberal sensibilities. So I can understand how that kind of a protest would not be as politically effective. But in this case, I think we have a really compelling issue to protest about, which is the ongoing genocide in Palestine, as well as the genocide in Yemen. I think that the more that people learn about these issues, they come to understand that it is not simply childish whining about not getting everything that we want. Instead, it will be seen as a stand of conscience against an atrocity, not against a lesser good, but against an evil. And there's another point that I would also like to make here, which is that voting for a third party in protest can help give you more effective rhetoric. There's a lot of people who will say, look, I agree with the long-term goals about trying to build an alternative, and we need to make sure that we are strong advocates for the Palestinian cause, but in the short term, we need to adopt this strategy of voting for the lesser evil because, it will have better consequences. But, I think there's actually some ways in which our long-term political goals, as well as our advocacy for very important issues, can contradict the short-term political strategy of voting for the lesser evil. The contradiction in one direction is very obvious. If we call out Kamala Harris for her support of the genocide, and we succeed in convincing people how corrupt the Democratic Party establishment is, and how bad Joe Biden is, and call him Genocide Joe and so forth, this will make some people less likely to vote for them. Sure, we can simultaneously advocate that people vote for them in spite of how bad they are because Trump is so much worse. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily incoherent. And I actually think that, that makes a lot of sense. I get that. But it's also the case that not everybody is rational in the way that you conceive of rationality. There are definitely people who will find themselves unable to vote for the lesser evil once they understand that it truly is an evil. So if you truly believe that the most important thing above all else is to just beat Trump and advocate for the blue team, then you should try to dishonestly sweep all of these problems under the rug and downplay either the issues themselves or the level of agency that the Biden administration has in these problems. So if you are someone who thinks that we should both call out the Biden administration for their complicity in the genocide, but still vote for them, then you're already not in the extreme blue MAGA crowd, because you believe that some level of political risk is worth taking in order to advocate for certain issues. I also think that the contradiction runs the other way as well. I think if you call out the Biden administration for all the bad that it's done and try to convince somebody that both parties are corrupt and that they have blood on their hands and so forth, but then you turn around and say, yeah, but you should vote for the blue team anyway, I think your message rings hollow. I'm not saying that it's necessarily incoherent, but like I said, there's a lot of people who don't share your sense of rationality, and they're going to hear that and they're just going to think that it sounds like BS. I really do think that advocating for the Democratic Party really takes a sting out of any pro-Palestine advocacy and any advocacy for building an alternative. And I think that's really important because I think that the Biden administration's support for the genocide in Yemen and the genocide in Palestine in particular are issues that have a really great potential to radicalize people. I know people who used to be in the blue MAGA crowd who are now saying, F Joe Biden, he has blood on his hands. I never thought they'd be saying these kind of things in a million years. In the long run, what's most important, I think, is that people wake up to a consciousness of their current political economic situation. Only then can we engage in an effective struggle for a better and more compassionate world and avoid more tragedies in the future. And I really don't like the idea of missing an opportunity to open people's eyes to how bad things are because of the rhetorical inertia from supporting the Democratic Party. I also think that this can serve as a morally clear, bright line for those of us on the left to draw to separate ourselves from liberals and stake out a clear identity in political discourse in contrast to them. I think in the long run, that can help. Now, I think to be fair, someone could say on the other side that voting for the lesser evil might make them more persuasive on key issues to different cohorts of people, like committed voters for the Democratic Party, by being able to earn more credibility as a pragmatic and reasonable voter. But I disagree. You certainly might be more well-liked by them, but I think that there's value in disagreeing with them on who to vote for because you really make them confront the fact that they are voting for someone who supports genocide. And I think that, kind of making people sit with that idea can really open their minds and get them thinking, even if they don't change their mind on who to vote for. And I think a lot of what I've been saying also applies to other long-term political goals like getting ranked choice voting. I've heard people say things like, hey, we need to first get ranked choice voting and then we'll be able to vote for a third party because then it won't have the spoiler effect. But I think that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. How are people supposed to be excited about ranked choice voting as an issue and getting money out of politics and so forth and other kinds of democratic reforms if there isn't a concrete alternative that they would prefer instead? It seems to me that first you need to get people excited for third party, and then they're going to want to get things like ranked choice voting and stuff. And if you get people excited for an alternative, like I explained before, not everybody has your sense of rationality. So that means that some people are going to vote for that alternative and that it's going to distract from support for the lesser evil. So these are some ways in which I think that support for long-term political goals kind of contradicts the support for the sort of short-term lesser evils Band-Aid solution. My third and final major point is that I think people have both an underestimation of how bad the Democrats are and how bad Joe Biden is, as well as an overestimation of how bad Trump is. who is certainly really bad. I hate Trump, he sucks. But you got people saying stuff like, oh, he's gonna put everybody into camps and there's not gonna be elections anymore. And I just find that pretty hard to believe. Like the election denial stuff is very bad, and I certainly think he would like to become a dictator if he was able to. January 6th showed that, but I just don't think he's able to do it because the system is not fragile enough for him to be able to pull that off. And, I think a lot of the other stuff that he's saying is just theater. Like, he said in 2016 that he was gonna lock up Hillary Clinton, and that never happened. When it came to foreign policy and domestic economics, he was pretty much a bog standard conservative president, which is, that's really bad. Tax cuts for the rich and increased militarism. So I'm not letting him off the hook. He is terrible, but I do think there's a little bit of hyperbole. There was a skit that I saw online the other day that I think really captures this sort of distorted thinking. And the skit went something like this. There was some guy who was going to buy coffee and he had to choose between like a vanilla latte and sewer runoff. And then he explains that, he actually wanted some other flavor like a mocha latte or something like that. And the barista responds telling him that, look, his only choices are vanilla latte or sewer runoff. And if he doesn't choose vanilla latte, then the store is going to change their policy and only sell sewer runoff to everybody. But even with such a stark choice, the man is unable to make up his mind and hilarity ensues. So it's clear that in the skit, the sewer runoff represents Donald Trump and the vanilla latte represents Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, depending on when the skit was made. And the man represents an undecided voter who was tempted to vote for a third party. And the reason that this thinking is so distorted is because Kamala Harris is not a vanilla latte. When choosing between Democrats and Republicans, you are choosing between two different flavors of sewer runoff. The Biden administration, of which Kamala Harris is second in command, is arming and providing diplomatic support for a genocide. It's so bad and so obvious that people have resigned from the Biden administration over this. Feel free to quote me on this one, and preferably out of context, but vanilla lattes do not support genocide. And it seems really inconsistent to me because I'll see these people say stuff like, oh, I can't imagine how anybody could see Donald Trump make fun of that disabled reporter and still want to vote for him. Which, for the record, that is a really bad thing to do, and it's a totally valid reason to not want to vote for the guy. But you know what's worse than making fun of a disabled person? Materially enabling a genocide. And, you have people who will say things like, hey, she's not really in control. This is really all Joe Biden's policy, and she has to just kind of play along to get along. And, I'm not in the White House. I don't see what's going on behind the scenes. And I think there is a fair discussion about just how much, agency she has. But I do think it would be ridiculous to describe her as merely a hapless bystander sitting in the passenger seat of the car. She could, at the very least, articulate in a tactful way that she has some disagreements with how Biden has handled it. She could also not celebrate Israeli aggression in Lebanon. And frankly, she could always pull the nuclear option and she could threaten behind the scenes to resign, right? I just find it absolutely impossible to believe that she has no leverage whatsoever, because the Biden administration has basically done nothing whatsoever to rein Netanyahu in. So I just find that really hard to believe that there's literally nothing that she could do. And I think if you understand the interests of the American empire and the more structural problems at play, I think it's also very unreasonable to think that Kamala Harris will really rock the boat. That being said, in defense of the other position, Joe Biden is uniquely bad on the issue. So I think that there's a little bit of wiggle room to debate her level of agency, but I certainly, like I said, I wouldn't describe her as a hapless bystander in the passenger seat of the car. And I will also add that it's not just Palestine that I'm upset about, but the Biden administration has been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia as they've been conducting a genocide in Yemen. The fact that people can't understand why this would be an uncrossable red line for some people, just shows how desensitized American liberals are to the amount of suffering caused by the American empire to those in the global south. I think people have not really come to a consciousness of just how much harm the American empire has caused. You see it in the rehabilitation of George W. Bush. Most people will acknowledge that the Iraq war was bad, but many people see it as a sort of well-intentioned mistake. A little whoopsie, like, it turns out there weren't weapons of mass destruction. We didn't know that. Our bad. And, we were trying to spread democracy, but the Iraqi people just weren't ready for it. And we usually talk about the consequences of the war in terms of the damage that it caused to us. It wasted our money. It wasted our soldiers' lives. And instead, people need to see it for what it was. It was a murderous war coming after murderous sanctions upheld in the Clinton era, brought on in an attempt to control a region of great strategic import. I also think that all this talk about the Democrats protecting and saving democracy is also ridiculous. Just like when Trump says he's going to be the protector of women or whatever. I think it's ridiculous for a few key reasons. Firstly, the Democrats undermine the rule of law, which is necessary for democracy. Supporting Netanyahu's murderous campaign not only completely undermines international law, but it violates domestic law as well. The Leahy Law prohibits military assistance to forces engaged in gross violations of human rights. So it's not only immoral, but it's also illegal. Secondly, the Democratic Party is dominated by and large by the same moneyed interests as the Republican Party, and when push comes to shove, it is those moneyed interests that steer their policy. And in my opinion, the 2024 presidential primary is a good example of that. My reading on the situation is that even though Joe Biden wasn't a very popular candidate, it was really only when the big donors started pulling out that he really felt like his hand was forced and he had to step back. And that's not to say that the voters have zero agency in the matter, because, I think the donors were pulling out because they didn't think he would be able to win the votes. But in my view, that's a good example of how the moneyed interests are the ones steering the ship, and voters are at best a constraint on where that ship can be steered. And to further drive this point home, I'll bring up the infamous Gilens and Page study from Princeton. And that applies to the American political system more broadly, not just to the Republicans. Thirdly, there's a number of ways in which the Democratic Party suppresses third parties like the Green Party, like suing to get them off the ballots for what are often frivolous reasons. That's just not something that you do if you're interested in having an honest and fair election where everybody's voice is getting heard. Instead, that's what you do if you're interested in consolidating power over a certain constituency. Fourthly, I don't think they're great for free speech. Congress passed a ban on TikTok, universities are cracking down on pro-Palestinian protesters, and of course, we haven't seen pardons going out for whistleblowers. I actually know somebody who is a long-term substitute high school teacher, and one time they brought up offhandedly during class that things had been a bit hectic for them at home since their mom and brother-in-law had been arguing about the Israel-Palestine conflict. They didn't take sides, but they said something to the effect of, it's a tragedy to see, innocent people get blown to smithereens. They didn't blame it all on Israel or anything like that. They just made a quick, nonpartisan comment and moved on with the lesson. And one of the kids reported it, and that report made it all the way to the principal, and they had to get reassigned to a different classroom. Of course, Joe Biden didn't personally set that policy or anything, but the Democrats do help set the tone of our national discourse. And to be frank, that sort of brazen restriction on free speech is something you would expect to see in Donald Trump's America. But no, this is Joe Biden's America. Lastly, I think it's really ironic to claim to be the champions of democracy when Joe Biden was effectively coronated without a serious primary. I'd feel a bit different if Joe Biden was genuinely popular and he won in a competitive primary against lots of other candidates like in 2020, although even that was one where the deck was clearly stacked against Bernie Sanders, who was the outsider. But no, the party had this whole rally around our guy mentality, and the matter was settled beforehand. And I understand if you say, hey, look, there weren't any good alternatives, I would have preferred Marianne Williamson. I think she has a conscience, and she sometimes at least says things of substance, but I understand that she has kind of the hippie Crystal Karen aesthetic and how that might be a turnoff, and you might not think that's so electable. Fair enough. But whose fault is that the Democratic Party didn't produce any alternatives? For one reason or another, be it malevolent or not, the Democratic Party did not produce any alternatives. And alternatives were sorely needed because Joe Biden did not have what it took to run again. And if they can't produce a genuine choice for us, that's part of the problem. I don't need to don a tinfoil hat and claim that they were chucking primary voters' ballots in the trash bin or anything like that, but it is clear that the Democratic Party, as an institution, has its own biases and its own aims and puts its finger on the scales. Now, of course, pretty much all of these points apply just as much, if not more, to the Republicans. Donald Trump was saying that he wants to deport pro-Palestinian protesters, for example. So they are worse. And someone could still argue in good faith, look, lesser evil is still lesser evil, right? So we should still opt for that. And what I've been saying so far doesn't necessarily challenge that basic mode of reasoning. But like I said earlier, this is a complicated issue where we have to weigh out different advantages and drawbacks. And in order to do that correctly, we have to have a sober appraisal of who the Democrats really are. So now that we're getting to the end, I'll summarize my thoughts and get to what I think is the least important part of the video, which is my personal overall determination on the matter in the case of the 2024 presidential election. My take is, if you are not in a battleground state, then you should definitely do a protest vote. And I would vote for the Green Party. I like Cornel West. He seems like a nice guy. He seems cool as a commentator, but I don't think he's ran a very good campaign. And I don't like the idea of voting for a campaign that centers just around a particular personality. I'd rather try to, build an alternative party. And I think the Green Party at least has the potential to become a party which effectively represents the working class. However small you think the benefits of doing a protest vote are, if you're in a safe state, I just don't see any reason at all for you to vote for the lesser evil, because you're not really making any difference on who is more likely to get into office. So there's basically just nothing else on the other side of the scales, right? For me personally, I think the biggest reason to do a protest vote is to be able to have more clear, simple, and consistent rhetoric surrounding the issue of US empire and Palestine more specifically. And I do really want to drive home the point that the Palestine issue has a lot of potential to radicalize people and wake them up to a consciousness of their class position and of the evils of empire more broadly. You don't need to be a crazy far lefty who reads theory all day to be outraged. All you need is a beating heart. And when you see the sheer destruction, the wounded and murdered children, and the lives of innocent people being swept into the trash like junk, you will be horrified and you will want an alternative. Now, if you're in a battleground state, I think that you actually have an actual discussion on your hands that reasonable people can disagree on, because there are at least some relative advantages and drawbacks to be had. And for all I've said, to be fair, even if we were to dismiss as meaningless hyperbole Trump's more deranged statements, and he's been making a lot more deranged statements recently, Trump would be worse on most, if not all, issues. That being said, I still lean on the side of protest voting them, because I think you can do more good by focusing on building the alternative and having clear rhetoric. Also, personally, I just don't want to pull the lever for somebody who supports genocide and ethnic cleansing. Now, the reason I downplay the voting decision itself is because, like I said, politics does not start and end with who you vote for in the presidential election. Whichever side you pick, it's important that you are engaged in building an alternative and that you help steer the collective narrative in a helpful direction. If Kamala Harris loses because of her stance on Gaza, you have to blame her and not the people who couldn't stomach pulling the lever for her. If you're politically absent and all you do is vote for the Green Party every 4 years, I respect it, but you're not really doing all that much. If you vote for the lesser evil, but you're active in left-wing orgs and you're doing stuff, I see you as part of the solution, even if I don't share your take on this tactical issue. But if you're the kind of person who votes for the lesser evil and then tries to blame the left for everything that goes wrong, and whitewashes the Democratic Party and does nothing towards building a real alternative, then I'd view you as being part of the problem here. And that concludes my rant on this subject. Thanks for listening. Please hit like or leave a friendly comment if you found this interesting. I appreciate that a lot. Until next time, this has been a Nerdy Tree production.